Hi everyone. My name is Avital Rubin. I was asked to speak about growing up with terrorism. I don't think it is something I can really put into words, but I can try. I'm not going to speak about the politics of terrorism. I'll leave that for my father. That's his job. When I moved out of Shiloh at age 18 to start my civilian national service, I couldn't leave my experience with terrorism behind. It is a big part of me and of my personality. Near the end of 2001, during the second Intifada, I was just a regular second grader, enjoying the Hanukkah vacation with friends. We were watching a movie. My younger siblings, Michal and Rubin, were bothering me. So when my father walked in, he offered a ride with him to Jerusalem. Michal quickly said no. She said she was afraid to pass the dangerous areas on the way. Rubin was only a 3-year-old and obviously had no choice, so he went. A few hours later, at dinner time, my mother gets a phone call, throws on her coat, and rushes out of the house. My neighbors started coming over, and someone told me that my father and brother were wounded. Meanwhile, my older brothers were watching the news, and I wasn't allowed to come into the room to see my father and brother on TV. I can only recall seeing for a second my baby brother wrapped up with bandages before someone took me out of the room. I'm not going to get into the whole attack story and the miracles that happened that night, but I will tell you that my father was wounded in his left leg and my brother was shot in his head, 1 millimeter from his brainstem. We started visiting in the hospital, first daily, then weekly. The moment I remember most is when I saw my father, who was such a strong figure to me, someone I can lean on when I fall. I saw him so weak and hurt on a bed, and he couldn't even walk. There were strange wires and tubes attached to his body, and a big loud machine at his side. My sister was scared to come close. I felt I was being so brave, giving my father a hug, something so normal for a 7-year-old, but in this case, such a challenge. After visiting my father, we continued on to my brother in the intensive care unit. I used to play with him all the time at home, but I remember feeling so confused because I was so excited to bring him pictures that I had painted at school, but he had no idea who I was. He looked at me as if I was a total stranger. Eventually, my father and brother recovered. Life seemed to go back to normal. Several years later, when I was in 7th grade, doing what a 14-year-old girls usually do, I came home from an activity at Bnei Akiva, the youth group. When I walked in the door at 9:30 p.m., the babysitter told me, "Your parents were supposed to be home an hour ago. I have no idea where they are, and they were not answering their phones." Then she left. The pictures going through my head were so frightening. I woke up my sister, and we both started hysterically crying. I called a few of my neighbors, telling them that something has happened to my parents. My parents were finally reached. They were okay and got home safely that night. But since then, I started having nightmares every night about death, with people around me getting hurt. I would cry myself to sleep with terrifying thoughts about death. I remember my mother sitting by my bed, trying to understand what is going through my mind, but I wasn't able to express what I was seeing and feeling. I didn't talk about it with anyone. I couldn't. My father had recently started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, creating therapy programs to help terror victim children to overcome trauma. My parents suggested that I start going for therapy in the center. I started going there for music therapy after my suffering had become really unbearable. I started going there once a week for an hour. Together with my therapist, I would sing and write songs that I could connect to, involving peace and war. The words peace and war now sounded so confusing. In therapy, I would often sing the song, "Where's the Love?" A regular song that today, when my friends listen to it, it brings them memories of 8th grade. To me, it brings flashbacks of a community in mourning and neighbors wounded. Talking about the contradiction, my best friend's father was the head of security in Shiloh. I remember watching a movie with her when suddenly her father got a phone call, grabbed a gun from under the couch, and ran out of the house. Here we are, two little innocent girls watching a children's movie, and we experienced that guns and terror are not only in the movies. Being a terror victim is not only being connected to a physical terror victim, it is being part of a community that has suffered repeatedly from terrorism. On the first day of the Hebrew month of Adar, before Purim, we have a tradition at school that the 8th graders stay up all night and decorate the school. I was together with all my friends. We put on music, and we're preparing to stay awake all night and have a good time. But a few hours later, we were all called to the main area of school. They told us that our teacher's son was in his yeshiva and that he was missing. We all were praying, so worried and so upset. An hour later, we heard the terrible news that 8 students from Merkaz Arav were murdered by a terrorist. My teacher's son was killed. That night was one of the most traumatic nights of my life. Thankfully, my family is healthy. But some of my friends no longer have a parent who can give them a hug after a long day. Trauma affects you and is expressed also years later. It is not a battle that is over. We have to contend with it all the time. My thoughts and fears didn't disappear. They just matured together with me and are a part of who I am today. They made me as strong and as sensitive as I am. Seeing so much death and suffering growing up only showed me how much I want to cherish and choose real life. Thank you all for listening to my heart and hopefully understanding my message. I do appreciate it.
I'm Avital's father, David Rubin. Today I'm not speaking as the former mayor of Shiloh, nor am I speaking mainly as a political commentator, and I'm not speaking as an author. Today I'm focusing on the psychological trauma that Avital and thousands of children in the biblical heartland of Israel have suffered from because it's usually ignored. On that fateful night that Avital just told you about, which was the last night of Hanukkah, we were driving home from Jerusalem when the car was hit with a hail of Kalashnikov or AK-47 bullets. Our car went completely dead and I felt a bullet crash into my left leg. Blood was gushing out of my leg as I turned to Rubin, my 3-year-old son, who was sitting behind me in the baby seat. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out, so I figured he was just in shock. After several failed attempts to start the car, the engine burst into action as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas and I drove 170 kilometers an hour, that's about 110 miles an hour, to get to the next community up the road where an ambulance soon arrived and the paramedics discovered that my son had been shot in the head, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. But we later learned the bullet had missed his brainstem, thankfully, by 1 millimeter. While flat on my back in the emergency room, I was told that I was the 1,000th terror victim to be hospitalized in that hospital in that previous year and a half. When a terror attack is reported in the news, it seems to be an absurd numbers game. We hear 3 dead and 7 wounded, 5 killed and 13 wounded. And then the media goes on to discuss the physical wounds, but the psychological trauma to individuals and communities is usually not discussed. There's a street in my neighborhood in Shiloh, which I call Terror Victims Row. Let's take an imaginary walk through this neighborhood, through this very real street. The first house is the Eldar family, whose 16-year-old son, Yonatan, was murdered by terrorists. In the second house is the Yerushalmi family. Their son, Shmuel, 17 years old, was killed by a terrorist while he was standing at a bus stop. In the very next house on that street lives the Kessler family, whose 19-year-old granddaughter, Gila, was also murdered while standing at a bus stop. 3 houses further down that street lived the Seatone family, whose 17-year-old son, Avi, was killed in a terrorist massacre at his high school. You go around the corner from that house, and you come to the Shoham family, whose 5-month-old baby was killed when terrorists on the side of the road hit him in the head with a massive rock while the young family was traveling home from a visit to the grandparents. There have been so many other terror victims in our area, but I've only described these so you will understand the intensity and the savagery of this terror war and the human suffering. But there is hope, which I will soon explain. After my 3-year-old son and I were wounded, we both had 2 operations. But when he finally came home from the hospital, he was screaming in the middle of the night several times a week, almost like that scream that he seemed to be trying to make in the car, but he couldn't make. It was clear that there was deep psychological trauma, but how do you treat a 3-year-old who was suffering emotionally? We were at a loss. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my living room, and my son, still with a bandage on the back of his head, was playing in a toy car. He picked up a doll and he looked over in my direction and he shouted out, "This is the Abba. This is the father. He has a hole in his leg," which indeed I did, even after plastic surgery. Then picking up another doll, he cried out, "This is the little baby. He was shot in the head." And my eyes filled with tears as I became very emotional because I realized that this was the first time he had expressed anything about the attack since it happened. I also realized that this is how we can heal his deep emotional trauma, through play therapy, because children are not like adults. An adult can usually sit and talk it out with a therapist. Children, despite their seeming openness, when confronted with trauma, they bury it inside. And if not treated, it comes out in all the wrong ways, in sleepless nights, in sudden bursts of anger, and panic attacks, as you just heard from Avital. When our recovery was near completion, I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund for the purpose of healing the trauma of the terror victim children and restoring some of the lost innocence of childhood that had been stolen from so many lives. As you saw with my daughter, sometimes trauma can be worse in those who haven't been physically wounded themselves. It's not an exaggeration to say that there is hardly a child in Shiloh and many other communities in Samaria that does not have a family member or a friend or a neighbor or a teacher who was killed or wounded in a terrorist attack. Every child has been affected, and every child needs our support. 13 years later, we now have a magnificent therapeutic educational campus with a formal therapy center using art therapy, music therapy, movement therapy, bibliotherapy. We have a separate horse farm for therapeutic horseback riding. And on that campus, 2 regional schools, kindergartens, informal therapy stations, such as a music playground and studio, and a petting zoo for animal-assisted therapy. And it works. Over 2,000 children are served on that one campus, with many others served in surrounding communities and in other parts of Samaria. We are also building playgrounds with communities, within communities, and we support youth programs and summer camps. In our summer camps, the children learn to swim, to play sports, and to go hiking. In a different part of Samaria, I must point out, controlled by Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority, there is another summer camp that is named after an arch-terrorist and is run by Abbas's Fatah terrorist organization. And there's another summer camp in Gaza that is run by Hamas, at which the children learn the great value of jihad, holy war against all non-Muslims. In both of these camps, the children also learn to use AK-47 assault rifles, just like the ones that wounded my son and me. It's also instructive to point out that the terrorists who wounded us were from the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, a branch of Abbas's Fatah. They are now in jail, but as terrorists who wounded Jews, they receive regular payments from the Palestinian Authority. Sadly, there is a sickness in the Islamic world that needs to be healed. It's a strange analogy, perhaps, but just as we in the biblical heartland of Israel are healing children and rebuilding for the future, an Islam that truly wants peace must heal itself of this sick jihadist mentality that teaches children to hate and to kill and to seek dominance over Jews and Christians. You are going to hear panel discussions on global terrorism, and many other speakers will voice their opinions. But please don't neglect the human side. Don't neglect the human side of this issue, because we can and we must make things better for the children. Our greatest role in this world is to turn darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness. If you really want to understand terrorism, get in touch with me, and I can schedule a very informative morning visit to our therapeutic educational campus in Shiloh, where we are rebuilding lives and restoring hopes for the future. While you're there, you can also visit ancient Shiloh, which was the capital city of Israel for 369 years. Last but not least, I brought two of my books with me here today: The Islamic Tsunami and Peace for Peace, which address the existential threat to Israel, to America, and to the free world, as well as a historically correct and pragmatic approach to the peace process. Everyone who is here today is welcome to receive a complimentary copy from my books table, which is outside at the Jerusalem Post table. Yasser Arafat, after his infamous "with blood and fire and jihad we will liberate Jerusalem" speech, which he gave in a mosque in South Africa, he defensively stated, "I will continue my jihad for peace." Well, I will let all of you interpret that oxymoron as you wish, but I prefer to say and do the opposite. My response to the terrorists is, we will continue to rebuild lives and rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel through the children. Thank you very much.